Please listen carefully.
Welcome to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. My name is Brad Stevens, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our guest today, Miss Eve Picker from smallchange.com. Now, you've been involved in many other things, but this is what you're doing at the moment, right?
That's correct, and thanks very much for having me.
Of course. It's a pleasure to have you. When you were here on the expo stage, I at least was really drawn into what you had to say, and so it's an honor to have you here and be speaking with you
today. Thank you.
Now, can you tell us a bit about what smallchange.com is and what drew you to it and how you kind of define what you're doing now?
Yeah, well, it's really a culmination of everything I've done. Small Change is what's called an equity crowdfunding platform, and these platforms, this industry really took off where Kickstarter and Indiegogo and donation-based platforms have left off. It is a way to gather a crowd of people to become investors in either businesses or real estate. And it's really grown out of legislation written by the Obama administration in 2012 called the Jobs Act. JOBS stands for Jumpstart Our Business Startups. And the purpose of that legislation was to find a way to help small businesses form capital. And that's because everyone knows that venture capital is a minute percentage of what helps businesses grow. And most small businesses are started with credit cards and friends and family. And so there was a lot of interest in what was happening in Kickstarter and other platforms like that at the time as raises were becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, and people were becoming pretty unhappy with the fact that they couldn't do anything other than be donors. And probably the most circulated story at that time was about Oculus Rift, where I think they raised about $2 million in donations and within a year or two sold the company for billions. And there was really a lot of anger there that, people who had donated to help them get off the ground couldn't participate in that upside. So that's really what the Jobs Act is all about. And they did a few things. It's really securities law. The reason why Kickstarter and Indiegogo can't raise anything other than through donations is they are not following securities laws. And securities laws are there to protect investors. That's really ultimately what they're there for. If you want to follow some securities laws, you're really following much more complicated regulations than platforms like Kickstarter and Indiegogo have to follow. So with the Jobs Act, they took two existing securities laws and changed them a little bit, tweaked them so that they look and feel a little more like crowdfunding. I'm taking a lot of liberties in my summary here. It's really more complicated that. And then they wrote a brand new securities law that is really pretty wildly different. And those laws rolled out over a period of 3 years, starting in 2013, and the industry has changed in response to each of those. So I think what attracted me from the beginning was the final law that came live, and that is called Regulation Crowdfunding. And it's a brand new securities law that took them 3 years to write. So it only went live in May of last year. And it is a really big departure for the SEC. It basically says that we want electronic platforms to act as intermediaries, raising money from investors for issuers. And that those platforms, it's almost like broker-dealer light. They perform the functions of a securities broker and dealer, but it is a somewhat light version. And everything happens electronically in this one place. There's no solicitation. The playing field is leveled so that everyone sees the same information at the same time, and anyone over the age of 18 can invest. So that is a radical departure right there, because most investments through securities laws have happened with accredited investors in this country, and accredited investors are only about 3% of the population. So this regulation really kind of opens the door to everyday people investing in businesses and in real estate, in their communities, outside their communities. What interested me most is that I saw an opportunity to raise money for real estate developers for the sorts of projects that I've always been really interested in, community-based projects that are especially difficult to find financing for, because often they're the first of their kind or different enough that traditional financial institutions are not or don't want to participate in them. They don't believe there's a market there that's strong enough for the real estate developer to be able to repay the loan. And that's the financing scenario that I always struggled with my real estate developments. I have a very successful portfolio, but it was always very difficult to convince banks to come to the table. And I would not have been able to do those projects except for the help of the city of Pittsburgh and the Urban Redevelopment Authority here. So that's essentially what Small Change, my platform, is trying to do, raise funds for very particular neighborhood-based, city-based, city-centric projects that I really think there's an enormous need for those sorts of funds.
Well, and so you guys
Sorry, that was very long-winded. Sorry. And that was summarized.
It's interesting because I'm intrigued from a perspective of there's some really interesting law stuff that goes into that, just from the perspective of trying to figure out what you can legally do. And I know that you guys, looking on your website, it looks like you've just moved from working with angel investor or certified investors into allowing anyone really to participate.
Yeah, well, so part of the process for us, we thought that regulation crowdfunding would come live sooner, and we started building the platform in 2015, and the laws were not really finalized. The regulation was not finalized until the end of 2015. So we went ahead and did a couple of offerings using Regulation D, which is only permits accredited investors to invest, because we were waiting and we really didn't know what was going to happen. And then when the regulations came live, it took us, there are many legal ramifications. We had to do things like restructure our company into 4 companies and just a whole bunch of things that go beyond just building an electronic platform. And it took us the good part of 2016 to build all of that and get and become. I'm not allowed to say an approved funding portal because FINRA doesn't really approve you. You become a member of FINRA, permitted to use those regulations. And we got that approval in October of last year, and we are probably one of, I think, 20 platforms, maybe 25 by now, that are permitted to use those regulations. So, it's a very complicated and burdensome process because the regulations are really all about protecting investors, and there's many things you have to do. You have to provide notifications and ensure that investors really understand what they're doing when they invest. And it takes a long time to build all of that into an electronic platform. So, and to make sure that you're being really thorough, they're pretty dense regulations. So yes, now we can raise money from anyone over the age of 18, and we are very close to going live with our first regulation crowdfunding offering. We're putting the finishing touches on it. The first one is always a learning experience, as I'm sure everyone knows. But I hope this year for us is going to be, last year was building the platform, getting approvals, building. This year we are rolling out offerings as fast as we can, hopefully at least one a month.
Well, you guys have chosen to work in that real estate space, and I wonder if you could share a bit about what you think it is. And I know you've worked in real estate for a long time and redevelopment. About what what makes that so important as part of the work that goes into creating better and more thriving
Oh,
places?
heavens. I could talk about that forever. So, my portfolio, the real estate, developers do real estate for all sorts of different reasons. And I'm an architect by training. I have a master's in urban design, and I've always been most interested in the impact that buildings can make on place, and how if you really care enough to make to work on a project in a meaningful way, you can really give something to the neighborhood or the city that it's in, and that really that matters to me personally. So in Pittsburgh, I picked neighborhoods really that no one else was working in, because I was really fascinated by the architecture here, and there was an opportunity with vacant buildings in places where really no one else wanted to go. But financing those projects was very, very difficult. So probably my most difficult project is a 30,000 square foot historic building in a neighborhood that is now really hot and was not at all hot when I went there the first time when I started doing this. But it took 12 sources of financing to get that project done. It was a $2 million rehab. That was the construction cost. I think I purchased it from the city for $1,000. It had a hole in the roof that rained all the way to the basement. We called it a green building because it was covered in basically green pigeon poop. It was a mess. It had been vacant for 15 years, and it was in the heart of an underserved community, and it was really a pretty major eyesore. And the city had it on its books and put an RFP out to developers to buy it from them and to redevelop it. And I responded to the RFP. In fact, I was the only one who responded to the RFP and went ahead with the project. So it took 12 sources of financing to get that project done. Of the $2 million, a local bank, and they have been a good partner in projects, would only lend $430,000. And so the remaining funds came from 4 different loans from the Urban Redevelopment Authority, historic tax credits, Lift National, a matching facade grant, money from the mayor. Wherever I could find it, we sort of scrambled to pull those funds together. And that was pretty typical of the project I did. I did a whole bunch of buildings with a similar sort of formula, maybe not quite as difficult. They didn't all need 12 sources of funding, but they could never show, a bank could never be convinced they would have enough cash flow to pay a full mortgage, as if it were, in a neighborhood that's really thriving. Now, these projects that I did, I always paid the mortgage. I always paid the debt. So they did work. It's just that banks have a very particular way of assessing projects, and one of the key things they do is they will get an appraisal, and an appraiser looks for 3 other projects just like it. Well, if you're in an underserved community and there hasn't been anything like it before, there's really nothing to compare to, and that's where the difficulties begin. So agencies like the Urban Redevelopment Authority are a very, very important part of these sorts of projects, in that our URA repurposed CBDG funds, community development block grants, into second deferred mortgages for developers to make these projects happen. But then in the mid-2000s, those funds also dried up. The Bush administration really sort of hacked away at that source of funds. And so I found myself in the position of no longer being able to get the help of the URA in this sort of redevelopment model that I created, because the funds were no longer there. Shortly after that, the financial crisis hit as well. So I stopped doing real estate. I stopped doing real estate development completely, because I didn't have a pool of equity partners. I really relied on, the city as being my partner. So I see this regulation crowdfunding as really filling that role in many ways. I'm being approached by developers from all over the country who can tell you very, very similar stories. There's lots of different versions of them. Like a developer I talked to in Salt Lake City who has a group of very strong investors. He's done quite a few urban townhouse projects, but he and his wife decided early this year that they only wanted to build net zero. And his investors don't understand that, and they're dropping like flies. So he really wants to see if he can build an alternative group of investors to support him. He's an experienced developer who knows what he's doing. Similar story with developers in LA who've been building these high-end townhomes in small lot subdivisions. They're very interested in doing something more affordable. Instead of 4 very large homes on a lot, they would like to try doing 10 smaller ones to see if they can reach a market that no one else is trying to reach in LA. And again, their investors are not convinced. So they're looking to develop a different pool of investors. I mean, I can tell you my own story. The building I just described to you with the 12 sources of financing, we're 12 years on now, and we are in a neighborhood that everyone wants to be in. And that building it's doing really well. It's cash flowing really strongly finally, right? So now I find myself in the position of the building is 50% occupied by a very successful co-working company that has been growing like crazy. And they want to take over the entire building. They want to turn it into their flagship co-working building. So I go back to the bank and I say to them, look, I'm either going to lose these tenants or I'm going to grow with them, and I'd like them to take over the operation of the building and become this flagship co-working space, because clearly that's a very rapidly growing trend, and I think we can all make more money that way. The latest appraisal on the building was $2.3 million, and the total loans available, or the total loans still outstanding, the balance on them is about $1.6 million. So there's room in there. I would like to borrow $250,000 in a credit line to make the improvements that are necessary to let this tenant take over the whole building. And they said no. And they said no because they didn't know how to appraise it. Now, this is like co-working is the hottest market in commercial real estate, but they don't understand it. They don't get it. They don't see it. They haven't seen it before. So we're back to the sort of the same story. Every time you try to do something a little bit innovative, something a little bit different, we're sort of checked by the rules that banks have. And I really feel like those financial institutions are kind of squashing the innovation out of cities, and I think there's a lot of opportunity that they are not taking because of the way they need to think about deals. So we'll be doing an offering on my building because I have no choice, and I'm pretty certain I'll be able to raise the money that way. And the bank's going to watch, and eventually maybe they'll be comfortable with it, but not today. So there's like so many stories like this, one after the other. They're all different. They're all different.
Well, that's so interesting too. I mean, that side of financing is something that we don't often think about as being so important in how cities are driven, and yet, as you note, it's just absolutely vital that there is so much of what we do comes from where we can get money to do things, and if we can't get money to do things, they're just not going to happen.
Well, I think that's what I learned when I was a developer. I'm really, really interested in buildings and the fabric of cities, but in the end, it all comes down to finance. It's 100% finance. And I'm sort of really, I want to do something more than be beholden to banks, because they are, on the whole, conservative and really not driven in this way. So living in Pittsburgh, you can hear I don't have a Pittsburgh accent, was really an amazing experience for me, because I learned all about community development here. And I moved into a neighborhood that really was on the brink of going in either direction. It was really dilapidated when I moved in. I became part and helped to found a community development corporation. That's where I cut my teeth on development. And I had a lot of neighbors who would do things before Kickstarter ever appeared, like pool their funds to buy their house so it wouldn't fall into the wrong hands. So I really believe that what I'm doing, that there are pools of people who want to see change in their own cities. Like they're driven by this passion to see change. And I think that what we're doing gives them an opportunity to really be involved in a meaningful way. So it's not just about how to finance it, but it's also how to engage people in their cities and their neighborhoods and help make that change happen.
Well, yeah, in some ways, it sounds like it's about devolving power back down to the very bottom level as much as possible.
I think that's right. That's a good way of putting it.
Now, through this work and other works, this is an LLC, right, that you guys are working with, or I'm sure it's a much more complicated arrangement than that. But you've done a number of things, both on the nonprofit and for-profit side of this, and I wonder if you could speak about how you kind of use the right tools when the projects come along.
Well, we're pretty young, so we're on our fourth raise now. We should have two more in the next couple of weeks, but I don't know how to answer that. I think, I do a lot of working one-on-one with developers. I think projects have to stand on their own feet, and some people are more sophisticated about understanding that than others. But it's really a question about carving out a piece of finance that can provide a return for a group of investors, and that could be any number of ways. I think perhaps once we're up and running, that return mightn't have to be even so significant for some projects. It may be more about a passion play than a financial return, but I don't know that with certainty yet. But I know that, like in Pittsburgh, there's a couple of projects I can think of that people would invest in without really caring very much if they received a financial return. They just wanted to see these things happen. But we're gonna have to test that. But the funds can be raised as a loan or debt, a debt or equity. It can really, I think it can really vary depending on the project and the project's needs. And that's, I think what differentiates us probably from many of the real estate crowdfunding platforms that are out there. There are two things. One is that we are impact driven, and we actually have a change index, and we won't take on projects that don't at least get a reasonable score and are doing some of the things that we think are important for cities. But we also haven't focused in on a particular financing tool. Many of the platforms there have sort of chosen their tool, fix and flip, mezzanine debt. They sort of stick with one because it's very easy to replicate. And I understand the economic reasons to do that, but I hesitate because I think in this particular arena there can be so many different financial needs. I think that we have to stay open to structuring deals differently.
Well, I think that, it's in some ways you guys are working in one arena, and there's just so many, you're in this new box that we're trying to figure out where this comes into play, how to use it, right? But I mean, you guys are kind of in the same lineage, I think, as, community development corporations, community land trust, land banks, things along that line. And this is a new, and I may be wrong, but it sounds to me like a new tool in some ways to kind of get at some of those same issues and try and get the money in the right place to fix some of those same problems, but leveraging perhaps a different pool of money in a different way.
Yeah, I think we see ourselves as an extra pool of money that can help in ways that no one else has really helped before, beyond community development, because the one project that we just did a raise from really stood on its own as a market rate project. It's a nice little project in Lawrenceville in Pittsburgh, historic building, but the developer's young, and the bank required a 25% equity. And he needed to raise that. He didn't have all the equity partners in place. So it's not only about these non-profit types of projects. It's for all sorts of different reasons. It's actually, I'm really excited about it because the developers that we're hearing from all over the country are amazingly high caliber and amazingly creative, and there's no two projects that are the same or have the same need. They're all wildly different. Pretty fun.
I can only imagine. Yeah, I mean, you must hear all kinds of amazing stories, and if you're anything like me, you're like, oh, I'd love to see that happen here, and have to rein yourself in a little bit. But
so, unfortunately, with regulation crowdfunding, we are not permitted to talk about these raises before they go live. Or I could tell you some really interesting stories, but I can't talk about them until the form is filed with the SEC. I can talk about the Regulation D raises, but I can't talk about regulation crowdfunding. It's one of the rules, and the reason why is if I talked about it, it could be considered solicitation. Mm-hmm. And again, they're trying to level the playing field and let everyone see the same information at the same time on an electronic platform. So that's the thinking behind it.
Well, now,
so you just have to sign up and come check it out.
Fair enough. Smallchange.com, right?
Yes.
Now, you mentioned earlier on that you kind of felt like this was the culmination of everything you've done. I wonder if you could just speak a bit about what that means to you to say that.
Oh, yeah. I've had a really long journey and an unexpected one. I started my career as an architect and then came to the United States to do an urban design master's at Columbia University, which started me thinking about architecture in a different way. And then I unexpectedly moved to Pittsburgh, and that was probably the most formative thing that happened to me in my career, because Pittsburgh was probably at its worst possible moment in time. And, it had emptied out, and there were a lot of vacant buildings, and I moved into a neighborhood. I bought this amazing Victorian house for next to nothing in a neighborhood that was really on the brink of going either way, and became involved with a nonprofit CDC that helped to resurrect that neighborhood. And that was something I had never been involved in before, and probably would never have been involved in Australia. I grew up in, a huge cosmopolitan city that didn't have those sorts of issues. I just fell in love with it. Being able to be in a place and strategically figure out how to make it better through the buildings was like the culmination of everything I've been thinking about. So, but then as I progressed through building this portfolio of buildings, it became more and more clear to me that finance was the basis for everything. Being able to get something done or not was all about money. And when in the mid-2000s those funds kind of dried up and disappeared, that became, even that became even more obvious to me. So I had been managing my buildings and filling them up and stabilizing them, and I took a couple of years when I decided I was going to shut down that business and move the buildings into the hands of property managers and free up my time to do something else. And I really didn't know what the something else was, but I knew that I wanted to kind of go beyond Pittsburgh and find something that I could do that was meaningful in this arena that would impact a lot of people. Someone came and talked to me about this, and I started talking through the idea with them, and it just seemed like a perfect fit. So it really is like, I think with this crowdfunding platform, I can help people finance the sorts of buildings I care so much about and make the change in cities that I care so much about. We've created this change index that really specifically addresses the sorts of things that matter in cities. And so now I'm sort of driving that financing, and I'm able to think about how to find all those people like me who are passionate about cities and want to invest in them, and put them together with these developers. Pretty fabulous. I think the timing is right, because I think that millennials are a group of people who are especially mission driven. And there's a great interest altogether in impact investment right now. So I think there's a real opportunity to make something big happen.
Well, it's so true. My wife and I, with our 401ks, it's been like trying to find an investment that we believe in has been really difficult. And so I'm excited to see more projects like yours take on. You can
actually invest on our site and on other sites with your IRA if you have a self-directed IRA. So there's quite a few crowdfunding platforms that let you do that. So you should look around.
Good to know. Well, I wonder, like, as you've done this kind of work and seen neighborhoods turn around and work in these neighborhoods, what are kind of some of the common denominators or components that you see that make for a thriving place or for a great city?
Oh, I think number one, people. I think there's always someone leading the charge, someone who sort of rallies people and is kind of at the forefront of making a place better. I think that's probably the most significant ingredient. At least one person. What other ingredients? I think that cities can make a huge difference in the way they evolve if they are forward thinking. I've seen here. I was fortunate enough to do a lot of my real estate development work under Mayor Tom Murphy, who is now with the Urban Land Institute as a senior advisor. He did some very bold moves that I think really impacted real estate development in the city. He took operational funds and created a loan fund for developers who would go into blighted neighborhoods to redevelop them. And there's a couple of things like that have really had a lasting impact. I think that cities can also get involved in helping to alleviate the burden of zoning and parking and code issues in difficult neighborhoods or downtowns that they want to see improved. If they can free developers from having to spend the time trying to figure that out, I think they can really move development forward. And I would say that our city, when I was working in downtown here, wasn't so good at that. And I spent huge amounts of time trying to figure out things that I think the city could have helped very easily with, that were really not about the building. They were about, okay, where do I park 5 people? It was just very, very time consuming. So I think thinking through a framework for developers to be successful can be a great first step for cities. So, and I think financing tools are very, very important. The Urban Redevelopment Authority in Pittsburgh is very skilled at taking grant funds from the federal level grant funds and state level and repurposing them for neighborhoods. But those funds have really dried up, so that has, I think, become much more difficult. I think sort of if cities think about building a framework for developers, whatever that is, whether it's parking or funds or whatever it is, I think they could encourage more development more quickly.
Well, those are some really interesting things. Now, that gets back to one of the questions that I was going to ask that I kind of skipped over about what the role the government has to play in all this. Because you've talked a lot in the past about coming from the bottom up, and so it's interesting to hear those things that the top down approach can alleviate some of those burdens to allow the bottom up in some ways to come through.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, the little things I'm thinking about, like downtown Pittsburgh, I argued for a long time about why can't we have a permit for early adopters who live down here to be able to park at a parking meter all day. It's very difficult to find parking inside buildings for some of these tiny sliver buildings that ought to be redeveloped. And something like that could really make a difference to a developer if they know they're redeveloping a little building, but it's a nice little building on an important block, and they're going to have 4 units, and they just want to have somewhere for someone to put a car, right? Mm. We're at the mercy of government in that sense, and it becomes very, very difficult to work through those hurdles. Now, eventually, after those early adopters, people don't care anymore, and they really don't want their cars anymore, and it no longer matters. But early on, having help there instead of feeling resistance would be great. But that requires, pretty creative and visionary people in government, which I wish we always had, but we don't always have, right? So, forward-thinking people, and that's not true of everyone who's in government, unfortunately.
That's absolutely true. I hate to call anybody out, but I think that one of the city councilors in Virginia Beach recently said that all the millennials can go move to Norfolk if they want public transportation. And I just cringe.
That's bad. It's really, really bad. Anyway, so, I think those are probably the most important things, and I don't know how you really solve all of these things. I think there's always going to be that conflict with people who don't, who are early adopters and see the possibility of something versus people who really don't see the possibility. And it's always going to be a struggle, but that's kind of half the fun too.
Well, very good. As we kind of come to a close here, I wonder if you could share with us a story that you think kind of encapsulates how to build stronger communities, or the work that you've done to do so.
Oh, that's really hard. How to build stronger. Well, I only do it I'm only familiar with one way to do it, and that's through bricks and mortar. There's tons of ways to build stronger communities, but I think there's so many things I could speak about here. So maybe like my tiny house project, I have a nonprofit as well, and I was working in a very underserved neighborhood in Pittsburgh called Garfield, and was working on a project to build a tiny house on a really forgotten lot that was tiny in itself. The purpose of it was really to turn eyes onto that neighborhood so that people would consider it as a possibility, because it's in the East End, which is wildly popular and has had more investment than any other part of Pittsburgh in the last 10 years by far, and yet it's this kind of it's a little hole in the donut of development. This little area, it's sort of topographically separated with a hill in the middle of it, and a lot of vacant land, like 400 vacant parcels in, I think, about 1,700 total. So a really high percentage of vacant parcels. And so we were looking for a way to get people to look at Garfield, which is kind of right across the road from a neighborhood that everyone wants to be in, and look at it as a possibility. So we thought, we'll build a tiny house. And that's what we set about doing. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done. There were so many issues that we ran into. It was like too small to fit the zoning code. The lot size was too small. We had to get variances so we didn't have to park a car on it, because if we parked a car on it, there was only 200 square feet left for the building, and a whole bunch of a whole bunch of things like that. And of course, there was no bank that would lend money for this project because there are no comps. There were actually no comps anywhere in the state, and maybe not anywhere in the country. I had an appraiser helping me find someone. He gave up. We built this tiny house on a foundation because in the city of Pittsburgh you can't have a tiny house on wheels, so it had to be a real house. And we discovered that the land had, the city when people had abandoned these neighborhoods, tore down the buildings very quickly and collapsed them into their basements. So we didn't have solid ground to build on. We had to dig out the entire basement and build another one. It was very expensive for a small house. And it wasn't. It was tough to get done. But then we came to the part we wanted to finance the construction financing, and by then I realized I was never going to get a loan from a bank. So we raised the funds through small change. It was the first project we raised funds for. We raised $100,000. The remainder was funded through grants, and we sold the house, which was our purpose, so quickly that the investors got an average of 32% return. So I think that's a great end to this story. This was a project that no bank would invest in, but ended up being a pretty decent investment for a bunch of people who believed in it.
What absolutely a great story to bring everything together here at the end. And for those of you all listening, if you'd like to hear Eve's talk, you can check it out on cityworksexpo.com. But thank you so much for being with us today, Eve.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast today. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and leave a rating. It really helps other people find out about our fascinating guests and find the information that we have to share. Lastly, please save the date for our upcoming event, October 5th through 7th in Roanoke, Virginia, and keep up to date by following us on Facebook and checking out our website, cityworksexpo.com. That's cityworksexpo.com. Thank you guys again, and look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.